The grinding roar of machinery shattered the morning calm, jolting me awake before my alarm even had a chance to beep. I tossed aside my blanket and struggled to align my legs in my wheelchair, heart pounding with the raw shock of that abrasive clamor. Rolling over to the window, I drew back the curtains to witness a sight I could never have imagined. An industrial bulldozer, its engine coughing white smoke, was wedged on my narrow lawn. A group of men in hard hats stood nearby, each wearing identical expressions of tense determination. And leading them, arms folded across her chest, was her, the woman everyone in the neighborhood, behind her back, of course, called HOA Karen. Tall, severe, and exuding the unshakable conviction that everything she did was morally justified. She pointed a manicured finger at the wooden ramp that led from my front porch down to the driveway. Within seconds, I watched in horror as the bulldozer's massive metal blade tore into the ramp's frame, splintering the planks that provided me with daily independence. "Stop! What are you doing?" I shouted through the window, voice cracking with a mixture of rage and fear. But either they couldn't hear me over the mechanical roar, or they simply didn't care. On that crisp spring morning, my precious wheelchair ramp, the structure that made it possible for me to leave my house and live my life, was being reduced to rubble. I spun my chair around, hands trembling as I attempted to dial the local police. As the phone rang, my pulse hammered in my ears. Would they arrive in time? Who authorized this demolition? Could it really be my own HOA, the same group that was supposed to maintain the neighborhood's best interests? My mind raced 1,000 miles an hour, grappling with the unthinkable. Yet even as I called for help, a stark certainty settled over me. This was personal. This was an attack on my right to exist comfortably in my own home, an assault carried out by her in the name of maintaining aesthetic standards. If you want to see how far one woman's prejudice and arrogance can go, and how a single act of brazen cruelty ignited a legal battle that rattled our entire community, keep reading. Because trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. My name is Luke Harding. I'm 31 years old, a freelance web designer, and I've lived in the Westbrook Estates community for almost 3 years. The place looked idyllic when I first arrived. Manicured lawns, neat rows of 2-story houses, and neighbors who mostly minded their own business. People told me I was brave to move into a suburban HOA community while using a wheelchair, warning me about the endless rules and regulations that might complicate my daily life. But I figured if I needed a ramp, I'd just build one. I never expected a war zone to break out over something so basic. When I purchased my home, using a chunk of my hard-earned savings and a favorable mortgage rate, my disability was already a well-known part of my life. A car accident during my college years had left me paralyzed from the waist down. Over time, I'd come to terms with it, learned how to reclaim my independence, and discovered that with the right modifications, a wheelchair doesn't have to limit your world. The Westbrook Estates Homeowners Association had given me some initial pushback about where I could install a ramp. They worried about visual coherence, community aesthetics, and property values. But with the help of a local contractor and a building permit from the city, I managed to construct a modest, tasteful wooden ramp that curved along the side of my driveway. It was stable, it was safe, and yes, it was even attractive, if you like that simple, craftsman-style look. The ramp blended in well enough, or so I thought. Still, from the moment I saw that enforcement chair of the HOA, whom everyone privately called Karen, glare at my ramp with thinly veiled disdain, I knew there might be trouble. She was the kind of person who measured a neighbor's worth by whether they complied with her every whim. She once scolded old Mrs. Thompson for planting roses that were too pink, and had threatened a family across the street for having a hammock in their front yard. While I found her meddling intrusive, I assumed my ramp had official city approval and was therefore safe. I was wrong. Under her watchful gaze, the HOA found new reasons each month to issue warning letters. Your ramp's railing color is slightly off from the fence post color, or the ramp's edges do not precisely align with your walkway. I always responded calmly, explaining that any additional modifications would be expensive and largely unnecessary. The real reason, I suspected, was that Karen simply didn't like the idea of a wheelchair user living here, messing up her utopian vision of Stepford-style uniformity. For a long time, these monthly annoyances never escalated beyond typed letters and snippy remarks at board meetings. I prayed that was the end of it. But that morning, watching a bulldozer shred my ramp was proof that her hostility had reached a new and terrifying height. By the time the police arrived, the ramp was already half demolished. Planks lay strewn across my grass like a shattered skeleton, nails sticking out in hazardous angles. HOA Karen stood off to the side, a half-smug, half-anxious expression on her face as if she'd been caught in some brazen act of vandalism, but wasn't sure she should truly worry because she believed she was in the right. Two uniformed officers approached, one stepping carefully around the wooden debris. "What's going on here?" asked the taller officer, scanning the scene with incredulity. I wheeled myself out the front door. Carefully, considering that the ramp was gone, I had to navigate a makeshift plywood plank just to get onto the sidewalk, and tried to explain. "My ramp has just been destroyed without my permission." Karen scoffed loudly. "It's an unauthorized structure. The HOA has the right to remove it. I warned him several times it wasn't up to code." Her voice sounded as if she were reading from a script she'd rehearsed for months, which she probably had. My fury came close to boiling over, but I remained calm. "I have a city permit for that ramp," I said, patting the folder on my lap that held all my documents. "I paid a licensed contractor to build it. The HOA never said they'd forcibly remove it. They did not have that right." The police took statements, their faces darkening with each passing minute. Eventually, the lead officer shook his head. "Ma'am," he told Karen, "this is looking like property damage, potentially a civil or even a criminal matter. If there's a valid permit, the HOA can't just tear it down. You'll need to consult your board's legal counsel." Karen bristled, her arms folded. "It's a violation of the guidelines," she insisted, voice taut with frustration. "Our board authorized the removal." That's when the shorter officer interjected. "Could I see that authorization in writing?" She spoke calmly, but there was an undertone of suspicion. Karen hesitated, her cheeks reddening. "Well, the board meeting minutes are not with me right now, but we have the right." I shook my head, trying to keep from shouting. "No, you don't. The Americans with Disabilities Act, city statutes, state laws, you can't just bulldoze a person's wheelchair ramp on a whim." Karen shot me a venomous glare. "I'm done arguing in the street. My attorney will be in touch." Then she stormed away, leaving the bulldozer crew uncertain and me fumbling to pick up the pieces, literally, of my destroyed ramp. That night, as I stared out at the ragged remains, I wrestled with a swirl of emotions: rage, humiliation, disbelief. I couldn't help but wonder what on earth Karen had to gain by doing something so blatantly cruel. Did she really think I'd go quietly? No, I wasn't going anywhere. And I vowed to myself, right then, that if it took every resource I had, I would fight back. News travels fast in a suburban neighborhood like Westbrook Estates. Within a day, neighbors ambled over to see the wreckage, wide-eyed and exasperated. Some offered hushed condolences, while others were terrified to speak up for fear of making themselves targets. More than one said, "I can't believe she actually did this." My closest friend in the neighborhood, a retired teacher named Stephanie, brought me a casserole and sat with me on the front porch. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, glancing at my useless front steps. "I know that was your only safe entrance." I exhaled a shaky breath. "I'm furious, Steph. Not to mention trapped. My back door had a small step, but not a ramp, so getting in and out by wheelchair alone was near impossible. I might have to pay someone to build a temporary one. But then Karen might tear that down, too." Stephanie pressed her lips together in disgust. "That woman's gone too far. You could sue. You should sue." I shrugged. I might not have the money for a prolonged legal battle. It was a painful admission, but the reality was that legal representation is expensive. My freelance income was steady, but not endless. The idea of taking on an entire homeowners association, especially one with a well-funded legal team, felt like David versus Goliath, but without the advantage of a slingshot. That's when Stephanie's eyes lit up. "What about the city or disability rights organizations? They might help you." She was right. The city building inspector had already visited and said they'd open an investigation. But a bigger nonprofit might have the resources to really fight this. The next morning, I spent hours on the phone and online, searching for disability advocacy groups. I drafted emails, attached photos of my ramp, pre- and post-demolition, and explained the situation in detail. Part of me doubted I'd get a response. These groups must get countless pleas for help, right? But I fired them off anyway, fueled by desperation and a burning need for justice. Meanwhile, the HOA tried to cover its tracks. I received a letter taped to my front door. Your structure was in violation of Regulation 4.7c regarding uniformity of front facades, and as such was subject to removal. No official signature, no letterhead, just a typed note that reeked of panic. They also threatened me with daily fines if I attempted to reconstruct the same ramp. I tore it up, anger coursing through my veins. I didn't know it yet, but that same afternoon, I'd catch my first glimmer of hope in the form of an unexpected email. Amid the spam and work messages in my inbox, one subject line jumped out at me. Your ramp demolition, National Disability Alliance. My heart leaped. The National Disability Alliance was a well-known organization that championed the rights of people with disabilities across the country. If they were writing back, maybe, just maybe, I had a lifeline. I clicked the email, my pulse thumping in my ears. Dear Mr. Harding, we received your documentation and images concerning the destruction of your wheelchair ramp. This case appears to be a clear instance of discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. We would like to learn more and potentially offer legal support. Could you schedule a call with us? I read the message 3 times, scarcely believing my eyes. After the initial wave of relief, a swirl of questions bubbled up. Was this legit? Could they really help me? Would the HOA just double down? I quickly set up a time to chat. The next day, I spoke with an attorney named Rachel Tomlin, whose voice carried a reassuring calm. She asked me to recount everything in detail, how I built the ramp, the repeated HOA harassment, and the final act of destruction. She listened intently, occasionally making sympathetic murmurs or clarifying a point of law. By the end of our conversation, Rachel sounded resolute. Luke, the Alliance is prepared to back you. This is a blatant violation of your rights as a disabled person. HOAs are not above federal statutes. They can't override your need for accessibility, especially when you had proper permits. We'll represent you if you're open to it. My breath caught. Represent me? As in pro bono. Yes, Rachel answered, a hint of a smile in her tone. We have donors who specifically fund cases like yours. We can't let someone bulldoze a ramp and get away with it. The ADA is explicit about reasonable accommodations, and a ramp is very reasonable. A wave of gratitude and validation washed over me. In one fell swoop, the sense of isolation and helplessness shrank, replaced by renewed determination. I appreciate that more than I can say. I managed, voice trembling slightly. I'm absolutely in. Rachel was all business. Excellent. We'll start with a cease and desist letter to the HOA, demanding they rebuild the ramp and halt any fines. If they refuse or stonewall, we'll file a lawsuit for damages and discrimination. Hanging up, I felt a spark of hope for the first time since the bulldozer's onslaught. Perhaps Karen's reign of terror had met its match. A week later, the entire Westbrook Estates HOA board, and particularly Karen, received a letter from the National Disability Alliance's legal team. I was CC'd on the email version. My heart pounded as I read through the crisp, professional language that unequivocally spelled out the violations. Violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ramp was a necessary accessibility feature. Property damage. They destroyed private property for which I had obtained a valid building permit. Discrimination. Targeting a homeowner with a disability under the guise of aesthetic concerns. The letter ended with a clear ultimatum. Either the HOA took responsibility and rebuilt or paid for a replacement ramp immediately, or we would file a formal lawsuit seeking damages, attorney fees, and further relief. The timing was impeccable. The letter arrived just days before the next HOA board meeting. Normally, these meetings were closed to non-board members unless you filed a special request to speak. But this time, my attorney requested that we attend, along with a local reporter from the city's newspaper who'd caught wind of the story. The spotlight was about to shine brightly on Karen and her associates. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. A handful of neighbors who had previously been too scared to speak out now found the courage to approach me, whispering their horror at what had happened and praising me for standing up for myself. Others were curious to watch the drama unfold, like it was the hottest new reality TV show in town. I admit, the sudden attention unnerved me. I wasn't used to being the center of a scandal, but nothing compared to the tension swirling around Karen. I spotted her stalking the sidewalks, lips pressed tight, eyes scanning for potential eavesdroppers. She always had a phone pressed to her ear, likely conferring with the HOA's attorneys or ranting to anyone who would listen. Occasionally, I caught her scowling in my direction, as though all of this was some petty personal vendetta and not a matter of civil rights. In the days leading up to the board meeting, Rachel and I fine-tuned our talking points. We had evidence, the building permit, photos of the ramp's destruction, statements from neighbors who witnessed the bulldozer in action. Karen's only defense seemed to be that the HOA had the right to remove structures that allegedly didn't comply with their guidelines. But no covenant in the HOA's rulebook could trump the ADA. Our position felt ironclad. The night of the HOA board meeting, the typically sleepy Westbrook Estates clubhouse was electric with tension. I arrived with Rachel by my side, a small entourage of supporters trailing behind. Neighbors, my friend Stephanie, even the local news reporter, notepad in hand. The board members sat in a row at the front, 4 men and 3 women, none looking especially eager to greet us. Karen was dead center, wearing a crisp blouse, her hair pulled back so tightly it might have been giving her a headache. "Let's call this meeting to order," said the HOA president, a wiry middle-aged man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "We have a matter on the agenda regarding property modifications and potential liability." His gaze flicked to me, then over to Karen. Rachel, all business, stood up. "My name is Rachel Tomlin, attorney for Luke Harding and representing the National Disability Alliance. We're here because Mr. Harding's wheelchair ramp was demolished. This is a direct violation of both federal and state statutes guaranteeing accessibility for individuals with disabilities. We demand immediate restitution and a full commitment to ensuring Mr. Harding can safely enter and exit his home." Karen's jaw tightened. "And I'd like to remind everyone that the Westbrook Estates HOA has guidelines about modifications to home exteriors. Mr. Harding's ramp was never fully approved by the Architectural Review Committee. It clashed with the community's uniform aesthetic, and repeated notices were sent." I leaned forward, heart pounding. "I had city approval, Karen. That supersedes any internal aesthetic guidelines. Plus, I never agreed to remove it. You had no right to use a bulldozer." My voice shook, half with anger, half with the weight of reliving that humiliating moment. Karen huffed. "We were told to remove unauthorized structures. Our board attorney assured us." One of the other board members, an older woman with curly gray hair, cleared her throat. "Actually, Karen, I never saw a vote on that. Did anyone?" She peered at the other board members. A few shifted uncomfortably. One shook his head. The gray-haired woman continued. "I recall there was discussion, but no official vote to demolish anything." Rachel seized on that. "So, if there was no formal board vote, who exactly authorized the demolition? Because from what we understand, Ms. Wilson here personally arranged for that bulldozer." Silence settled like a heavy fog. Karen's cheeks reddened. She fiddled with a stack of papers, clearly floundering. "Well, someone from the enforcement committee mentioned that the ramp was out of compliance, and we have broad authority to ensure guidelines are followed." The board president massaged his temples. "Let's be clear. If we're facing a lawsuit, and from the letter I've read, it looks quite serious, any action taken without full board approval puts us all at risk, especially if it conflicts with federal accessibility laws." I glanced at the local reporter, who scribbled furiously. Karen's expression twisted with a mixture of panic and defiance. She tried again. "We can't let people just build whatever they want. Property values will suffer it." Rachel cut in, voice steeled with resolve. "Karen, property values do not trump the Americans with Disabilities Act. Period. Furthermore, the city building permit was legitimate. Your conduct is not only morally reprehensible, it's legally indefensible. We are prepared to file a formal complaint in federal court if necessary, seeking compensatory and punitive damages for discrimination." A hush fell over the room. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, the president cleared his throat. "We need time to consult with our own counsel. We'll meet in executive session. For now, Ms. Tomlin, Mr. Harding, we'll respond to your demands in writing within the next 2 weeks." Rachel gave a polite nod. "Understood. But be aware our patience is limited. Any further harassment or delay will only strengthen our case." With that, the meeting adjourned in an icy atmosphere. Karen stormed out a side door, refusing to look in my direction. I exhaled, relief mingling with tension. The lines were drawn. Now we'd see if the HOA would do the right thing, or if we were heading straight for litigation. In the days that followed, Westbrook Estates buzzed with chatter about the ramp fiasco. Rumors flew. Some claimed the HOA was going to settle immediately and rebuild the ramp at their expense. Others whispered about Karen lawyering up on her own, trying to shield herself from liability. A small but vocal minority argued that the ramp never looked right anyway, proving Karen still had a handful of supporters. But overall, the tide of public opinion seemed to lean heavily on my side, especially once the local paper ran a front-page story titled, "Wheelchair Ramp Raised by HOA, Resident Cries Foul." The article featured a photo of me in my wheelchair, staring at the rubble in disbelief. It also quoted Rachel and even included a snippet from the city building inspector, who confirmed my permit was valid. The piece unleashed a wave of public sympathy, with readers posting outraged comments online. Even those who typically disapproved of litigation culture recognized how egregious it was to bulldoze a wheelchair ramp. My email inbox and social media lit up with messages of support, including from other disability advocates who urged me not to give an inch. Many even offered legal advice, though I was already in good hands with the National Disability Alliance. Despite the swirl of drama, the HOA's official channels stayed quiet. No letters, no calls. Karen retreated into the background, presumably biding her time or cooking up some strategy. Meanwhile, the board's promised 2-week window was ticking away. One morning, a neighbor texted me a screenshot from our private HOA forum. Karen had posted a lengthy diatribe, ranting that outside forces were meddling in the neighborhood's affairs and that certain residents, i.e., me, were tarnishing the community's reputation. She insisted the ramp was out of compliance. She ended her post with a scathing remark: "If people want special treatment, they need to live somewhere else." The vitriol in her words made my blood boil. Special treatment? All I wanted was the same right to access my home as anyone else. My finger hovered over my keyboard, tempted to fire back an equally harsh reply. But I paused, remembering Rachel's advice: don't engage publicly. Let them bury themselves in their own statements. Instead, I screenshot her post and sent it straight to Rachel. Another piece of evidence to strengthen our case. On the 13th day, one shy of the deadline, the HOA board finally sent a response through their attorney. The letter was lengthy and cagey, but the bottom line was this: we regret the incident. We believe Ms. Wilson acted in good faith but without complete board approval. We are prepared to offer partial compensation for the ramp's destruction, but we deny any violation of the ADA. The homeowner should have sought explicit HOA permission in addition to city permits. I read it twice, my jaw tightening. It was almost comical. They were trying to shift blame to me for not seeking explicit HOA permission beyond the city's building permit, ignoring the fact I'd provided them with multiple notices about my plan. They basically admitted Karen had no official go-ahead, yet they refused to concede that tearing down the ramp was unlawful. And partial compensation? That wouldn't begin to cover the cost of the new ramp, let alone the emotional distress or the brazen violation of my rights. Rachel's reaction was succinct: not good enough. She sent back a firm reply, stating we would proceed with litigation if they didn't agree to a full settlement, rebuilding the ramp to code at their expense, plus damages for the discrimination and property destruction. We gave them one more week to respond. That week felt like an eternity. I struggled daily with the reality of living without a proper ramp. My uncle, a handyman, rigged a temporary metal one in the back, but it wasn't stable enough for me to navigate alone. Each time I had to wheel up or down it, I feared a sudden slip or misalignment. My independence was drastically curtailed, and I felt furious and new each time I remembered why. But as the days dragged on, the tension in the neighborhood only increased. Several neighbors mentioned that Karen had pulled them aside to warn them about how my ramp would supposedly cause property values to nosedive. Some found it laughable. Others were unsettled by her attempts to rally them against me. It was as if she refused to accept the moral and legal reality, digging herself deeper into a hole of her own making. When the HOA's final response arrived, a curt message insisting their prior offer was fair and final, Rachel didn't hesitate. She filed the lawsuit in county court, naming both the Westbrook Estates HOA and Karen personally for property damage, violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and discrimination. The complaint requested a court order mandating the ramp's reconstruction, monetary damages for emotional distress, and attorney fees. It also highlighted Karen's personal involvement and sought punitive damages given the egregious, willful nature of her conduct. I'd never been part of a lawsuit before. Seeing my name as the plaintiff felt surreal, equal parts terrifying and empowering. But this was bigger than me. As Rachel put it, if we let them get away with this, it sets a precedent that HOAs can steamroll disabled residents and ignore federal law. The local press, having already tasted the story, pounced on this new development. Headlines like "Wheelchair Ramp Battle Goes to Court" splashed across the local news, and even a few regional outlets took interest. Then, shockingly, a national news site picked up the story, focusing on the fact that a homeowner's wheelchair ramp had been bulldozed by an HOA and that a major disability organization was now suing. Suddenly, my phone was ringing nonstop. Reporters wanted interviews. Advocates wanted to voice support. Even random strangers sent me messages of encouragement, along with horror stories of their own negative interactions with HOAs. I realized just how deeply a story like this resonated across the country. People were tired of seeing petty tyrants use bylaws to trample basic human rights. Karen, on the other hand, must have been feeling the heat. She stopped walking the neighborhood with her usual imperious air. Some neighbors said they saw her leaving early in the morning and returning late at night, as if trying to avoid any confrontation. The once all-powerful enforcement chair now seemed to be hiding from the very community she'd ruled over. But the calm before a legal storm can be deceiving. Behind the scenes, lawyers were gearing up, depositions were being scheduled, and tension simmered below the surface. We were on a collision course, either a dramatic settlement or a trial that could make waves nationwide. Our first big step in the legal process was discovery, a phase that involves gathering evidence, answering interrogatories, and conducting depositions. The HOA's legal team was forced to turn over emails, board meeting minutes, and any relevant documents about the ramp. I spent hours combing through them, heart-lurching at each mention of my name or references to the wheelchair guy. One email, in particular, sent from Karen to the board, stood out. He's ignoring our guidelines and flaunting his ramp in front of everyone. If we don't take action, it sets a precedent. Next thing you know, we'll have a dozen unsightly modifications. This needs to be removed ASAP. Let me handle it. The arrogance was astounding. She'd basically declared a personal vendetta. Another email showed that at least 2 board members urged caution, warning her that the structure was probably protected by the ADA. But Karen brushed them off. "I don't care what he or the city says," she wrote. "HOA rules come first." When I read that line, I practically shook with rage. HOA rules come first. Over federal law and basic human decency? Over the right of a disabled person to enter and exit his home? It was so blatantly discriminatory that Rachel nearly cackled with glee at the strength it gave our case. "This is a smoking gun," she declared. Then came depositions, sworn statements under oath. Karen's was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at a local law office. Rachel and I attended, eager to see how she'd attempt to rationalize her actions. Sitting across the table from her, I noticed her fidgety body language, the tension in her jaw. Gone was the haughty figure who once bulldozed my property. She looked cornered. Rachel led the questioning. "Ms. Wilson, did you or did you not hire the demolition crew that removed Mr. Harding's wheelchair ramp?" Karen gulped. "The HOA Enforcement Committee reached an agreement that..." Rachel pounced. "I asked if you hired them, not the committee." Silence. Then, "Yes, I contacted them," Karen admitted, voice tight. "On whose authority?" She squirmed, glancing at her attorney. "On the authority of the HOA." The board was aware. Were they? Because the meeting minutes show no record of a vote authorizing demolition. Her face flushed. I believed we had a consensus that the ramp was out of compliance." Rachel's tone turned frosty. "Ms. Wilson, do you recall writing an email stating, 'I don't care what he or the city says. HOA rules come first'?" She read the line verbatim, then slid a printout across the table. Karen's eyes darted over it, her expression stricken. I was upset. I didn't want the neighborhood's standards compromised. Rachel leaned back in her chair, letting the silence hang. Karen's attorney tried to object, but it was too late. We'd gotten what we needed on record. The discrimination was loud and clear. Outside of the legal wrangling, life in the neighborhood grew increasingly tense. The usual calm suburban vibe now felt charged with gossip and speculation. Some folks who once worshipped Karen, bowing to her every complaint, avoided eye contact with her in public. Others outwardly supported her, claiming the lawsuit was frivolous and that I was just looking for a payout. But the city had publicly confirmed my permit was valid and that the ramp met safety standards, so that argument fell flat with most residents. Meanwhile, the board found itself split into factions. The president and two others realized the HOA was on the hook if they didn't settle quickly. Another faction seemed more sympathetic to Karen, convinced this was all a big misunderstanding. Rumors abounded that Karen might be forced to resign her position to shield the HOA from further legal exposure. Despite the internal politics, the board quietly reached out to Rachel, asking about the terms for settlement. Their biggest fear was the possibility of paying a massive judgment if the case reached a jury. I overheard one phone call where the HOA's attorney basically begged Rachel, "Let's resolve this quickly, out of the public eye." Rachel stood firm. She insisted on a written apology, a newly built ramp that met my needs, full coverage of the cost, plus additional compensation. The board balked at the idea of a public apology. They worried it would tarnish the image of Westbrook Estates. But Rachel reminded them that a trial would garner even more media coverage, not to mention legal fees and potential punitive damages. All the while, Karen maintained her usual arrogance in public, even as cracks in her confidence showed in private. She ranted online about ambulance-chasing lawyers and posted one meltdown after another on the HOA forum. Her supporters chimed in with bigoted remarks, revealing an undercurrent of hostility I found chilling. But I also saw many neighbors condemning those comments, reaffirming their belief in inclusivity. Just when it seemed we were trudging toward a slow, inevitable settlement, a new element threw the entire situation into overdrive. A national cable news show picked up the story. Someone from the local station must have pitched it. Before I knew it, my phone rang, and a producer introduced herself, asking if I'd be willing to do a live interview. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to become a national spectacle. But Rachel encouraged me. "This is more than your personal battle, Luke," she said. "This is about setting a precedent for disabled homeowners everywhere." A big spotlight could pressure the HOA and Karen to do the right thing. So I agreed. 2 days later, a camera crew arrived at my house, filming the broken remains of my ramp and capturing my interview. I tried to speak from the heart, explaining how it felt to have my independence bulldozed and the emotional toll of fighting for something as basic as access to my own home. The segment also featured comments from the National Disability Alliance, highlighting the systemic issues of HOAs clashing with residents' rights. That night, the piece aired across the country. The reaction was immediate. Social media buzzed with outrage, empathy, and scorn for Karen's actions. Hashtags about HOA overreach and accessibility rights trended regionally. Donations even poured into the National Disability Alliance from viewers who wanted to support my case. For the first time, I felt a shift in the power dynamic. We weren't just David fighting Goliath. We had an army of onlookers cheering us on. Karen, on the other hand, was thrust unwillingly into the limelight. A snippet of her deposition was leaked, her admission that she'd personally arranged the bulldozer. Coupled with her email about not caring what he or the city says, it painted her as the face of cruel, unchecked HOA power. Suddenly, her name was being dragged through the mud by commentators on national TV. She tried to go on the defensive, issuing a hollow statement about protecting property values, but it only fueled more backlash. Within days of that national coverage, the HOA's attorney reached out to Rachel in what sounded like a near panic. They wanted to settle now? The negative publicity was too much. Homeowners were furious that their property values really were being threatened, not by my ramp, but by the scandal swirling around Karen's discriminatory act. Rachel was cautiously optimistic but demanded that Karen be included in any settlement. After all, it wasn't just the HOA that bulldozed the ramp. Karen orchestrated it. "We want personal accountability," Rachel insisted. No scenario where she just ducks behind the HOA's insurance policy. When that news circulated, some expected Karen to dig in further, but it seemed her fortress was crumbling. The depositions, the national coverage, the public outcry. She was cornered. If she tried to fight alone, the mounting legal fees would bury her. The HOA was also pressuring her to cooperate, anxious to stop bleeding money. Behind closed doors, negotiations ramped up. It was surreal to be at the center of such a high-stakes conversation. At one point, the HOA's legal team offered to build a new ramp identical to my old one, plus a small sum for my troubles. I refused. The troubles weren't small, They were massive. I'd been effectively imprisoned in my home, disrespected, and subjected to public humiliation and bigotry. Rachel demanded a more substantial damages figure, coverage of all legal fees, a written apology from both the HOA and Karen, and a strict injunction preventing them from removing any future accessibility modifications for me or anyone else in the neighborhood. The board balked at the apology portion, but Rachel was adamant. "We're not budging," she told them. "This isn't just about money. It's about principle." Finally, late one evening, my phone buzzed. Rachel's voice sounded triumphant. "We've got it," she said. "The HOA and Karen have agreed to our terms. They'll rebuild the ramp under licensed supervision, pay for all your legal fees, provide a sizable settlement for damages, and issue a formal apology. Karen is also resigning her position on the HOA board." I breathed out a long, shaky exhalation. Relief, vindication, and a strange tinge of sadness all mingled in my chest. This fight had consumed my life for months, bringing out the worst in some people but also shining a light on the best in others, like Rachel, the supportive neighbors, and the disability rights advocates who stood by me. We hammered out the final details over the next few days. The official statement arrived in my inbox, bearing the HOA letterhead. It read, "We sincerely apologize to Mr. Luke Harding for the removal of his wheelchair ramp and any distress caused. Moving forward, Westbrook Estates Homeowners Association pledges to uphold accessibility rights and comply with all relevant federal, state, and local regulations. We regret that these events occurred and recognize the importance of inclusivity in our community." Attached to it was a separate apology from Karen, scrawled in tight, tense language. She took full responsibility for hiring the bulldozer and acknowledged that her actions violated the ADA. Reading her words, I felt no warmth, no empathy in her tone, just a forced acceptance of defeat. But it was enough. Legally, ethically, and morally, she'd been compelled to own her wrongdoing. That was the best outcome I could have hoped for. Construction on my new ramp began almost immediately. This time, I hired a top-tier contractor recommended by the city's Disability Services Office, ensuring the new design was even sturdier and more user-friendly. The HOA footed the entire bill, plus offered to landscape around it to ensure everything looked tasteful. A small crowd gathered during the ramp's final inspection, cheering as I rolled down the freshly laid surface with ease. Stephanie, my ever-supportive neighbor, dabbed tears from her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," she said, hugging me when I reached the driveway. "You stood up for yourself, and for everyone who might have faced this kind of discrimination." I smiled through my own wave of emotion. It was a group effort. Without the National Disability Alliance and neighbors like you, I'd still be stuck inside. In the aftermath, my story continued to garner interest. A few national outlets followed up, praising the outcome as a win for disability rights. Some labeled it an example of HOA tyranny gone wrong, while others framed it as an uplifting tale of how the law can protect marginalized individuals. Whatever the angle, the message was consistent. Bullies don't always win, especially when confronted by a determined community and a solid legal foundation. Karen was nowhere to be found during the ramp's unveiling. Rumor had it she was laying low, possibly even considering moving out of Westbrook Estates to avoid the shame and gossip. I couldn't muster any sympathy. She'd orchestrated an act of outright cruelty. If leaving helped her find perspective, then I wished her well, but it was no longer my concern. Although our settlement concluded the main dispute, its impact rippled far beyond Westbrook Estates. Rachel told me that other homeowners associations across the region took notice. Some updated their covenants to explicitly respect ADA accommodations, fearing a similar lawsuit. A local radio station interviewed me about how communities can embrace inclusivity rather than stifling it with arbitrary rules. Meanwhile, the National Disability Alliance capitalized on the publicity to raise funds for future cases. They even featured my story in their newsletter, highlighting the ramp demolition as a cautionary tale about ableism in suburban America. The donations that poured in would help other disabled individuals fight back when faced with housing discrimination. Knowing I played a part in that broader mission filled me with a sense of pride I hadn't experienced in years. On a more personal level, the legal victory reminded me that my disability does not define me as powerless. Yes, I rely on a wheelchair. Yes, I need accommodations like a ramp. But that doesn't diminish my rights or my agency. Through grit, support, and the might of the law, I could stand up, figuratively, at least, to an entire HOA and come out on top. A month or so after the settlement, I was out watering my front garden, something I could now do freely thanks to the new ramp, when a figure appeared at the edge of my driveway. It was Karen. For a second, neither of us spoke. Her posture was stiff, her expression unreadable. Then she took a breath and walked up, stopping a few feet away. "I'm leaving Westbrook," she said tersely, eyes flicking between me and the ramp. "Listing my house next week. Can't stay here with all this." I turned off the hose, water dripping onto the pavement. "All right," I said, carefully neutral. There was an awkward pause, as if she expected me to say more, maybe to express sadness or relief. But I wasn't sure how I felt. She let out a sigh. "I want you to know. I didn't mean for it to get so out of hand." Her voice wavered slightly, the first crack in her armor. I have a vision for how this neighborhood should look, and she flailed, searching for words. I went too far. There it was, a shred of contrition, albeit too little too late. I studied her face, remembering all the distress she'd caused me and the hateful messages she'd posted online. "Well," I said finally, "apology or not, you bulldozed my ramp. That's something I'll never forget. But I hope you learn from this." She nodded stiffly, as if acknowledging a point in a debate. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. I watched her retreating figure, uncertain whether to feel satisfaction or pity. In the end, maybe both. She'd lost her standing in the community she once ruled with an iron fist, and now she was leaving. The ramifications of her actions had caught up with her in every possible way. Life settled into a calmer rhythm after Karen's move. The HOA elected a new enforcement chair, a friendly retiree who promptly declared that accessibility was a priority and that no modifications helping disabled residents would be challenged without thorough discussion and legal clarity. In a single stroke, the neighborhood's atmosphere improved dramatically. Neighbors began placing welcome mats with bright designs, installing playful lawn decorations, and testing the waters with new, more creative paint colors for their shutters. The fear of arbitrary crackdowns was gone. During the next HOA meeting, the board officially adopted new guidelines that specifically addressed accommodations for disabled residents, referencing the ADA in plain language. I attended that meeting, receiving a standing ovation when the motion passed. I felt a warm flush of pride, relieved that out of such a negative event, real progress was made. As for me, I continued my freelance design work, occasionally taking on projects for nonprofits that championed accessibility. My new ramp stood as a tangible reminder of my perseverance and the community's willingness to change. It also symbolized the broader victory. Don't let bullies or bureaucratic red tape bar you from living your life. Months rolled into a year. The lawsuits buzz faded, replaced by new neighborhood concerns, a proposed park renovation, debates over holiday lighting guidelines, the usual suburban humdrum. But the story of the ramp never really disappeared. People still whispered about the time the HOA tore down a wheelchair ramp whenever a new resident moved in and asked about the local lore. I'd occasionally receive emails from individuals in other states who found my case inspiring. They wrote to say they'd used the precedent to push back against their own HOAs or landlords. Each time, I felt a surge of gratitude that I hadn't rolled over and given up. One bright Saturday morning, as I guided my wheelchair down the ramp to check the mail, I paused halfway and took in the view. Sunlight dappling the lawns, kids playing catch in a yard, birds fluttering around a neighbor's feeder. This was my home. Despite everything that had happened, Westbrook Estates remained a place of comfort. It was mine to enjoy, freely and without restrictions that endangered my autonomy. I patted the ramp's railing, which felt sturdy and warm under my hand. In a strange way, I felt thankful for the ordeal. Not because it had been easy, far from it, but because it showed me the power of standing up against injustice, no matter how intimidating or well-funded the foe might appear. It taught me there are allies out there, like Rachel, Stephanie, the National Disability Alliance, who will stand shoulder to shoulder with you when your rights are trampled. And yes, it also proved that arrogance and cruelty, personified by Karen, can be toppled, even in the most buttoned-up suburban enclaves. The lessons learned here extended beyond me, beyond Westbrook Estates, to every disabled person who's had to fight for a seat at the table or, in this case, a ramp at their doorstep. Because in the end, no matter how many bulldozers come our way, no matter how loud the bullies shout about their rules, the law is clear. Equality and dignity are not optional. They're the very foundation that lets us live with pride in the place we call home.